The NYPD now releasing body cam footage of officers arresting anti-Israel protesters who had barricaded themselves inside Columbia University's Hamilton Hall on Tuesday night. We're now learning about the group that helped coordinate the chaos. The People's Forum is a registered charity with operations made possible by millions of dollars in donations. They held a meeting in Manhattan just hours before the demonstration. Washington Free Beacon senior investigative reporter Joe Simonson sat in on that meeting over Zoom, and he joins us right now. Joe, great to have you. Thanks very much for being here. Can you tell us a little about what you heard, what you learned from that Zoom?
Thank you for having me. Absolutely. So during the meeting, which lasted about 2.5 hours, you had senior employees of the People's Forum, which is, as you said, a self-described Marxist group funded by left-wing millionaires, held a planning session both for May Day protests and also for escalating the Columbia protests. And essentially what the organizers of the meeting said is that we want to recreate, and I'm quoting them, recreate the summer of 2020. And that was met with cheers and claps. After those individuals spoke, the attendees broke into separate meeting groups and talked about how to, again, escalate these protests against Israel. Hours later, and a lot of these attendees had just come from Columbia, hours later, they were back at Columbia, and that's when the protests got much more serious, as you mentioned, illegally occupying this building, and as one janitor said, was holding one of them hostage.
Exactly. Yeah, that was incredible. Now, the People's Forum is made possible through donations, and you have reported that the group's operations are made possible in large part by a $12 million donation from Goldman Sachs' charitable arm. Tell me about that.
Exactly. Now, Goldman wants to be very clear that this is none of their money. This is simply a client-directed fund, except it's run by Goldman Sachs. The Goldman Sachs employees basically do the day-to-day operations to keep it up. But that's exactly right. This individual named Neville Singham likely directed that $12 million donation to the People's Forum in 2019. And that $12 million donation was the largest single donation that the Goldman Sachs Philanthropy Fund gave that year. And Goldman Sachs gets really upset when you mention this fact because they pretend that they had no choice, that if any client wants to donate money to any group, they're happy to oblige. Now, I personally find that defense kind of risible.
Well, you also reported that Singham is an American businessman who lives in China. And he reportedly helps finance the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda worldwide. Tell me about the CCP connection here.
Absolutely. Neville Singham, he's a very wealthy individual who moved to China. He calls himself a Maoist. His wife, if your viewers are familiar with the group Code Pink, which is this far-left anti-war organization that also defends China. And so the New York Times has covered this individual, other outlets have covered this individual. This man is proud to work with the CCP. He attends CCP meetings, and he funds a number of left-wing organizations in the United States, including the People's Forum, that this isn't just a normal anti-Israel group. This is a group that, after the October 7th attacks in Israel, if you remember, in Times Square the next day, there were people celebrating these attacks and celebrating Hamas. There's an individual there waving a swastika around. That protest in Times Square that was so horrifying was organized by the People's Forum, which again is funded by this individual, Neville Singham, who lives in China. What's disturbing is that you have a wealthy American businessman subsidizing the Chinese government's propaganda. Again, this is an organization that wants to overthrow our country, and the worst part of it is that he gets a tax break. He funds this and gets to write it off on his taxes. He gets to donate millions and millions of dollars to a group that calls for a revolution, which is in itself a violation of the IRS code, and essentially the rest of the country gets to subsidize it. He pays less taxes to do the Chinese Communist Party's bidding.
Well, that's incredible to me. I mean, I call this the philanthropy scam, and it's not the only way that it's a scam, but you have these groups that claim that they are philanthropies, and then they're actually sending their money to political ideas. and then getting tax breaks.
That's exactly right. And this is a huge problem within the nonprofit structure of our tax code. And the IRS just has no interest in enforcing this at all. All these groups that are shutting down bridges, that are occupying college campuses, that are engaged in violent anti-Israel protests or protests that are meant to disrupt commerce, virtually all of the groups behind it are charities. That's what they're called. They're charities, just like the Red Cross. And the IRS, again, is clear. You cannot be encouraging or organizing law breaking. You can't even have members at your events who are doing law breaking. The IRS is plainly clear that your charity status should be revoked, but the IRS is nowhere to be found on this. And that's one of the most frustrating aspects of all of this. These groups, these millionaires and billionaires get to donate to these groups and write it off, and we have to deal with the consequences.
That is incredible. Joseph, we so appreciate your time this weekend. Thank you.